Back. So we're really happy to have Steve Redding tell us about globalization and pandemics and the pros and cons of disease in a world with trade. So Steve, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, George, and the organizers of the conference for the invitation to participate in this event honoring Ron. I remember first reading Ron's 1965 paper on the structure of simple general equilibrium models and just being blown away by its elegance and beauty. And I also remember the excitement of first meeting Ron as a giant in the international trade field. His work and example are really an inspiration for all of us working in international trade. And so it's a particular honor to be part of this event. And so I'm going to present a joint paper with Paul Antras and Esteban Rossi-Hansberg, as George said, on globalization and pandemics. I think Paul is also here for the seminar and he can answer questions in the chat as I'm talking. And then also, of course, feel free to intervene and ask questions as well if you want to. So what's the motivation for this paper? Well, as you all know, globalization and pandemics have been closely intertwined throughout human history. And so the Black Death arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 trading ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. And as you also all know, the word quarantine originates from the Italian word for the 40-day period of isolation for trading ships and their crews during the Black Death pandemic. And then, of course, much more recently, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, the first human-to-human COVID-19 infections in Europe occurred in Starnberg, Germany, where a local parts supplier, Webasto, was holding a training session with a Chinese colleague from Wuhan in China. And then here in the United States, as documented in the New York Times, Washington Post, the kind of myriad cases of where infection through COVID have been spread through business travel and trade. And so what we're going to try to do in this paper is try to look conceptually at the two-way interaction between globalization and pandemics. So does globalization make societies more vulnerable to pandemics, as often claimed? How do pandemics affect the volume and pattern of trade? A source of debate throughout the current COVID-19 pandemic. And so we're going to develop a model of human interaction that's going to provide joint microfoundations for the gravity equation from international trade, and then also for the susceptible, infected, recovered model of disease dynamics from the epidemiological literature. And through jointly microfounding these two phenomena, we're going to be able to look at the interaction between them. And so the contact rates, which are often taken as exogenous in the epidemiological literature, are here going to be endogenous to international trade forces. And then on the other hand, the existence of pandemics is going to feed back to influence international trade through general equilibrium effects and also through behavioral responses. And you'll see that there are going to be a number of sort of subtle interactions between these two phenomena. And so to isolate them in a clean way, we're going to sort of develop our argument in three stages. In a first step, we're going to allow globalization to affect pandemics, but there to be no feedback from pandemics to globalization. And so that's going to correspond to the case when agents are unaware of the threat of infection, and there are no deaths or productivity effects of the infection, and so no one has any incentive to change their behavior. Nonetheless, even in this case, globalization is going to have very subtle effects for the dynamics of the disease, in particular, because the contact rates between agents are endogenous to international trade incentives. And so we're going to sort of establish a number of subtle results here. So firstly, whether a pandemic occurs in the open economy is going to depend upon the country with the worst domestic disease environment. And so even if I, as a country, have a good disease environment, in an open economy, I'm not necessarily going to escape the pandemic. It's really going to be the country with the worst environment that matters. Very, very strong epidemiological externalities. Perhaps surprisingly, we're going to show that globalization, so lower trade costs, can either increase or decrease the range of parameters where a pandemic occurs, and can either raise or reduce its severity. And more generally, disease dynamics will be much more subtle in the open economy than the closed economy. And so even if you would have a single wave of infection in the closed economy, in the open economy, it's going to be possible to have multiple waves. And then in the second stage of the analysis, we're going to introduce one feedback from pandemics to globalization by building in general equilibrium effects. And so this is going to correspond to the case where agents remain unaware of the infection, but the infection causes deaths. And so the infection is going to have general equilibrium effects through changes in relative labor supplies in different countries. And the analysis would be very similar if the infection reduced worker productivity. That would sort of operate in a similar way to deaths. And so interestingly, in this case, even though there's no individual level behavior response because people are unaware of the infection, nonetheless, a country that has a more unhealthy disease environment is going to experience more deaths, which is going to increase its relative wage through a labor supply effect. And that's going to make other countries less willing to trade with the more infected country. So in other words, it's going to be a form of general equilibrium social distancing, even though there's no individual level behavioral response. And then finally, we're going to move to the full model where we're going to incorporate those general equilibrium effects, but then also allow individual level behavioral responses. And so in this sort of general model, when individuals choose how much to interact with agents in another economy, they're going to internalize the threat of infection from those interactions. In this case, we're going to sort of uncover further subtle interactions. In particular, now the unhealthy country, the country with a worse disease environment, is typically going to see its relative wage fall. Okay, so the opposite of the labor supply effect. Why? Because in the unhealthy country, there are more infections. Agents in other countries are going to internalize the threat of infection when trading with that nation. And internalizing that threat will lead to a reduced demand for the goods and for interactions with the unhealthy country, which in equilibrium is going to reduce its relative wage. And so individual level social distancing is going to kind of overturn those general equilibrium effects. We'll see that introducing behavioral responses in this last version of the model is absolutely key to generating large reductions in the ratio of trade to output, as we've seen in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll kind of go through how that works in the model. And these behavioral responses also generate quite large welfare effects. So obviously, behavioral responses reduce the threat of death, but the trade-off of that is going to be less trade and reduced welfare gains from trade, as we'll see as we go through the analysis. Okay, so quite a rich set of interactions between globalization and pandemics.
So Steve, just to clarify one thing, you mentioned the virus through trade. So, I mean, goods and services would be an interesting margin. Are you going to assume the same contagion through good trade and services since it's not obvious?
Okay, so great question. So we're going to have a kind of very simple model of trade and human interaction. And so in our model, all trade is going to involve an element of human interaction. And so the two are going to go together. But we're going to have two parameters in the model, or two sets of parameters, which are going to control the extensive and the intensive margin of trade. And so the extensive margin of trade is going to involve interactions as you're going to get goods from suppliers. And the intensive margin is how much do you trade conditional on meeting with a supplier. And so in the model, there are going to be these two sets of parameters that can control how trade intensive interactions are. But the way we're going to model it is that all trade is going to involve some element of human interaction, as I think is sort of consistent with a lot of the empirical literature. There's a lot of evidence that trade involves business travel. Obviously, you could think of sort of richer models where you have multiple sectors and the importance of interaction could vary across sectors. And I think that would be kind of great, really interesting extensions to look at. But we wanted to try to kind of really lay down kind of analytically on these mechanisms of how globalization and pandemics interact in as kind of simple framework as possible. And so we're going to have this sort of very simple model where all trade involves an element of interaction, but we can kind of control just how important interaction is relative to trade with these parameters for the intensive and extensive margins.
Thank you.
But great question. So just briefly in the kind of limits of time constraints, we're obviously going to build here on a very large literature in trade on the gravity equation, and more generally, as we were just discussing, on the role of business travel in the process of international trade and greasing the wheels of international trade. And then clearly, we're also going to touch base with the large epidemiological literature on the SAR model, and the part of that literature that recently has involved economists. And so of that kind of recent wave of research, we're going to be sort of closest to multi-group SAR models, and particular papers simulating spatial SAR models. The sort of key difference really with what we're doing is we're not so focused on COVID per se, but we're really trying to provide an analytical characterization of how globalization and pandemics interact with one another in a pretty rich environment, as I was just discussing. And you'll see how we trace that out as we go through. And then finally, as we were also just discussing, we're also going to be connected to a large empirical literature that has provided evidence that trade plays a role in the spread of disease. So for example, there's some very nice papers on the Black Death showing that it exhibits a kind of gravity-like property as the Black Death spreads around countries around the globe alongside trade routes. And that's going to be sort of consistent with the model that we develop in a second. So as I said, our sort of three-stage argument, we're first to kind of isolate different mechanisms. We're first going to consider this case where globalization affects pandemics, but there's no feedback in the other direction, which is going to be the case when agents are unaware of the threat of infection and there are no deaths or productivity effects of the infection. Okay, so how are we going to model trade and interactions and how the two are related to one another? Well, we're going to try to develop this kind of simplest conceptual framework possible. And so what's that going to look like? Well, we're going to use a model very familiar in the international trade literature. We're going to have an Armington model of trade, but the key difference here is going to be that the differentiation is going to be at the level of household. So every household is going to have its own variety that's differentiated by household. And so we're going to think about a world with a set of locations, curly J, and that could be many locations in principle, although today to kind of deliver the analytical results as cleanly as possible, we're mainly going to focus on the case of two locations, so two countries, East and West. Each of these countries is going to be inhabited by a continuous measure L of households. And each of these households, as we just said, has the blueprint for making a variety, horizontally differentiated variety. And they also have one unit of labor that they can use to produce. So to connect with the model of disease dynamics later, we're going to think about each of these households as consisting of two individuals. There's going to be a buyer whose purpose is to go and procure varieties from other households. So the buyer is going to go leave the household and go and find varieties from other households, interact with those other households, and trade with them. And then there's going to be a seller whose job is going to be producing the varieties and selling those varieties to the buyers of other households. So other households are going to come to the seller and buy this household's own variety. Okay. We're going to think about trade involving both Iceberg variable trade costs as a standard, and then also involving mobility frictions, which affect the extensive margin of trade and the number of interactions that take place.
Steve, just a quick question.
Yep.
You're not thinking about this as like a matching process between buyers and sellers. It's strictly a distribution technology where I have to spend some time do I have to spend time as a seller to distribute?
So great question. I'll say more about that in a second. Yeah,
okay.
There are going to be no search and matching frictions. It's going to be kind of full information. I see all the varieties available. And what each household is going to do is it's going to choose endogenously what fraction of the varieties to source from every other country around the world. I mean, in principle, you could add a layer of search and matching frictions onto that, but we don't have that here.
It's really about distribution.
Yeah,
way we think about it.
Thinking about optimally what is the optimal choice of the extensive margin and the intensive margin.
Okay, and then are these the only contacts between people? There's no contact between co-workers that could spread the disease, or it's all through consumption based?
So great question. There are going to be domestic contacts for sure as domestic households trade varieties with one another, and my buyer is going to get varieties from other domestic households. The buyer of other domestic households is going to come to my seller and source my variety. But trade and interaction are the only way in which these households interact with one another. There are not going to be any kind of friendships or other ways in which households interact.
It's a bleak world you're picturing, no friendships.
That may be true.
The whole conference is about friendships. So
absolutely.
Go ahead,
the way we think about this is really, it's just like a general model of spatial interactions. And as you're going to see for our results, what really matters is just that there are economic incentives to these spatial interactions. And these spatial interactions are influenced by the economic incentives of traveling between different locations. And obviously in reality, that travel is multidimensional, it's friendship, it's trade, it's many, many aspects of them. But a lot of the results we're going to develop today would kind of carry over in general in any kind of model of spatial interaction. You'll kind of see that as I go through. And we think this is just a kind of particularly simple or clean way of thinking about these interactions. But any model you write down, which gives you a gravity model of interactions, which is a pretty large class of models, will have a very similar flavor. Will feature many of the results I'm going to develop in a second. So yeah, great question. So here are Iceberg costs of trade, pretty standard. There's going to be a distance cost, so Dij is distance with some constant elasticity. And then Tij is going to be a policy friction that might potentially be asymmetric. And so that's going to be a tariff or some other policy barrier that countries can impose on trade flows. And then as we were just discussing, there are also going to be some extensive margin frictions. The the costs of sourcing varieties from different households. Those costs are going to depend upon the number of varieties you source from another country. So if I want to go to more households in another country, that's going to be more costly because I have to travel to meet all those other households with a parameter constant elasticity fee. And then those mobility frictions, the costs of going and meeting these households, they're also going to have a distance component. It takes more time to travel further, again with a constant elasticity. And then in principle, countries could impose a mobility friction, a friction on movements of people that's different from the friction on flows of goods. And so mu ij is again going to be a policy friction that might potentially be asymmetric. To ensure the second order conditions are satisfied for all values of those frictions, we're going to assume that the elasticity of substitution is bigger than 2, and then we've got enough curvature in this trade cost function, okay, that phi is sufficiently large. And in particular, we're going to focus on an interior equilibrium where each household only sources a fraction of the varieties available from other countries and from the own country. You know, it's straightforward to consider a corner solution as well, but just the interior equilibrium is the more interesting one. Okay, and so that's the sort of basic setup of trade and interactions. So just to add a little bit more detail and see what this framework gives us. So we're going to model Armington differentiation in a constant elasticity substitution way. And so what is welfare going to be? Well, that's just going to be the sum across all the countries I interact with, including my own country, the integral of the measure of varieties that I source from households in that country. Okay, and in our notation, we're going to use Nij for the number of varieties sourced by country I from country J. Okay, and so the first subscript is always going to be the country of consumption, the second subscript, the country of production. Okay, and Q is going to be the quantity of each variety I'm sourcing. We're going to model those extensive margin costs we just introduced. We're going to model them as a utility cost here. So they enter negatively in utility. It costs you utility to source varieties because the buyer is away from the household, and that reduces utility. We have an appendix in the paper where we show it's actually isomorphic. If you want to model those sourcing costs in terms of labor, you get exactly the same results up to a constant. So it's entirely isomorphic if you want to think about the sourcing costs as incurring labor. Obviously, as standard with the CS preferences, we're going to get a standard expression for the intensive margin, the quantity the country I sources from country J. That's just going to depend upon wages in I, productivity in J, wages in J, bilateral trade costs, and the overall price index, the cost of competing varieties in the sourcing country I. Okay, very, very standard. Given the CS structure, it's perhaps not surprising that we get a gravity equation for international trade. And so we get the very standard expression for the share of expenditure that country I devotes to country J. And it takes the usual form where that depends upon bilateral resistance or the bilateral frictions between I and J, and then also multilateral resistance, the frictions for all the possible pairs that I could source from. So very, very standard form. And then key to thinking about the dynamics of disease in this framework, bilateral interactions are also going to have a gravity equation structure, take a very, very similar form, constant elasticity form, and that's going to be kind of key to being able to keep track analytically of how the disease spreads between the countries when we come to that part of the model in a second. And notice here we've got separate extensive and intensive margins of trade here. And so we look at the distance coefficient here. This combination of parameters affects the extensive margin. Okay, so the trade elasticity there is going to depend upon the elasticity of substitution, but also the parameters of the sourcing cost function, how convex those sourcing costs are. Whereas the intensive margin for revenue will just have the standard trade elasticity of 1 minus sigma. And then obviously the overall trade elasticity in the expenditure share is a combination of the extensive and intensive margin elasticities. So rolling forward to thinking about welfare, which will be kind of key later when we look at the welfare effects of the pandemic. Here I've just kind of reproduced our gravity equation. Again, when you see that's a constant elasticity gravity equation, it's perhaps not going to be surprising that our model is going to fall within the ACR class, where the domestic trade share is going to be a sufficient statistic for welfare. And so aggregate welfare, which we're just going to measure as the real income of each household times the measure of those households, is going to take a fairly standard form. Here's the domestic trade share as usual with a constant elasticity. Two key differences from the usual ACR setup. Firstly, because we've got these extensive and intensive margins of trade, the exponent on that domestic trade share is a combination of the extensive and intensive margin parameters. And it's not going to be so easy to estimate that combination of parameters from the gravity equation up here. If you look at the coefficients on distance or trade policy barriers or mobility frictions, they differ in systematic ways from that exponent. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated within the structure of the model to estimate the right exponent on the domestic trade share. And then secondly, importantly, when we're in a pandemic and we have deaths, of course, aggregate welfare is also potentially going to fall because we have deaths and the labor supply falls. And that decrease in labor supply is itself going to be a function of trade. And so that's going to be a kind of an entirely new mechanism that would be kind of outside the standard ACR class of models. And then to simplify things later, we're going to sometimes use this composite measure of trade frictions, capital gamma. And that's just going to be a composite of both the intensive margin policy parameter T, the extensive margin policy parameter mu, and the effect of distance. And that will just kind of clear up some of the later expressions. How about the general equilibrium in this model? Well, it's going to be super simple to determine, as in our usual constant elasticity gravity model. The general equilibrium is basically going to reduce to solving a system of equations for the vector of wages in every country. And that's this goods market clearing condition down here, that income in every country, W times L, has to equal expenditure on the goods produced by that country, the expenditure share in each market around the world, multiplied by the income of each market around the world. And as a standard, that system of equations satisfies gross substitution. So by standard arguments, there's going to be a unique wage vector that solves that system of equations. And so we've got a unique general equilibrium. Once we get that wage vector, we can recover trade shares, welfare, and all other endogenous variables of the model. So let's now get into thinking about how trade influences human interactions, looking ahead to thinking about how that's going to affect the dynamics of the pandemic. So I've just reproduced at the top of the page here, the model's prediction for the extensive margin of trade, the number of interactions, Nij, just written it in a slightly more convenient form. And notice the only endogenous variable here is the vector of wages, W. In this first step of our argument where globalization affects pandemics, but pandemics don't feed back to influence globalization, that wage vector is going to be constant throughout the course of the pandemic. And so we're going to have constant bilateral interactions between countries. How do trade costs affect those interactions? Well, we've got a couple of results here. The first one is pretty straightforward. The second one is sort of more subtle and going to be more important later. So what's the first result here? When you reduce foreign frictions, so trade barriers, frictions to foreign interactions, even taking into account general equilibrium effects of reducing foreign trade costs, that reduction in foreign trade frictions is going to increase international trade relative to domestic trade. Fairly intuitive. You're reducing the relative cost of foreign interactions, and so you increase the amount of foreign interactions relative to domestic interactions. More subtly, when you're thinking about how do trade costs affect overall interactions, the sum of domestic plus foreign interactions, that's actually much more subtle in the model. And so I'll just kind of show you one sharp result we can get and then talk about what happens more generally. So when countries are symmetric, so they have the same labor supplies, productivity, and all trade costs are the same. So gamma Ij is equal to gamma for all countries. Then a decline in those symmetric international frictions actually leads to an increase in overall interactions, the sum of domestic plus foreign interactions. And that's going to be important later because it means when countries are symmetric, you reduce trade barriers, overall interactions are going to go up. That's going to create a presumption that more globalization might increase the spread of disease because it's raising the intensity of interactions. But as we've just anticipated, that result's not general. It's not necessarily true for when countries are not symmetric. So if we depart from the symmetric case, when countries differ in size or other parameters, then it might be that when you reduce trade costs, you don't have to reduce overall interactions within every country around the globe. And that's going to play a role later on. We're going to see that actually the effects of globalization on the spread of disease are really, really subtle. And we'll kind of use that later when we characterize the effect of pandemics. And so those are the kind of key trade parts of the model. Moving on now, we want to see how we're going to embed that into the model of epidemiological spread of disease, how we're going to kind of microfound that standard SAR model. Well, that's going to turn out to be very simple the way we set up the model. We're going to sort of think of the household's problem that we just characterized as corresponding to a standard day in the household. And so in the morning, the buyer is going to leave the house and it's going to go and visit NII, sellers at home, NIJ, sellers abroad, and source varieties from them in a way we just characterized. The seller in country I is going to sell the household's own goods to both domestic buyers from other households, NII, and foreign buyers from households abroad, NJI. For simplicity, we're going to think that the buyers travel separately from one another, so they don't meet along the way. And we're going to assume that there's perfect disease transmission within the household. So if the household's buyer gets infected, the seller is automatically also going to get infected that day, and vice versa. So now let's look at the dynamics of disease, and we'll see it's going to map very nicely into the standard SAR framework.
Sorry, Steve, can I interrupt for just 1 second? I should have asked this a previous slide ago.
Oh, that's great.
One feature I was trying to understand is there's certainly a scale to transactions that would be different on a domestic and an international transaction, or even a domestic transaction in the face of the disease, right? Like just before, this is when I always start talking about inventories. Just before, at the start of the disease, everyone sort of stocked up a lot. I don't see how this, and you know, obviously we stock up in a different way on international goods when we make those transactions versus domestic goods. And so I'm trying to think about like how I should figure that into this framework. I guess there's a dynamic element, but there's also kind of the relative importance of the contacts per unit of expenditure. Yep,
so great question. So we're absolutely going to have the scale effect in the model. So there is going to be a different scale to domestic and foreign transactions. So average sales conditional on trading will be different for domestic transactions and foreign transactions because of the trade frictions. But you're right that our static model of trade, our model of trade is static. And so we don't have inventories. We don't have a kind of a dynamic problem. I think, you know, in principle, you could add that into the model. So, you know, for example, you're investing in building up a stock of contacts. So NII is a dynamic problem. Yeah. And in fact, if I have time later in the model, later in the paper, we have something that's a lot like that. We have kind of adjustment cost to adjusting your stock of interactions, which are going to work in some ways similar to that sort of dynamic investment model. Yeah. But for the basic model, it's going to be a static model just to try to capture in the simplest way possible how trade shapes these domestic and foreign interactions. We're absolutely going to have different scales to domestic and foreign interactions. So yeah, great question. So to sort of get the intuition for how this SAR model works, let's look at the equation for the change in the number of agents that are infected. So this is the fraction of households that are infected during the pandemic. How is that going to evolve? Well, there are going to be some new domestic infections. How can they occur? Well, they can occur because my buyer goes to other domestic households and I source NII varieties from those other domestic households. But they can also occur because domestic sellers come to my household and there are NII domestic sellers coming to my household. And so that's the number 2 here. I've got 2 times these domestic interactions on the buyer and the supplier side. When is an infection going to occur? Well, that's going to if a share of domestic households SI are susceptible, they're not infected yet, but they're at risk, they're going to get infected when they meet with infected households. And that is going to occur with the probability, the share of households that are susceptible times the share of households that are infected in the usual way. But then, of course, there are also going to be transitions into infections from the domestic buyer going abroad. And how many of those infections are going to occur? Well, that will depend upon the measure of varieties being sourced from abroad, NIJ. It's also going to depend upon the share of domestic agents that are susceptible, but not infected yet, and the share of foreign agents abroad who are infected, IJ. Okay, and notice that in both the domestic infections and the foreign infections, we've got these parameters, little alpha. They're the exogenous parameters that determine how good the disease environment is at home and abroad, as a result, for example, of health policy and other characteristics of the domestic and foreign country. And we can do comparative statics on those later and see how they influence the dynamics of the disease. Okay, and so we've got some foreign infections from the domestic buyer going abroad. But we've also got some foreign infections from foreign sellers coming to the home economy, coming to the domestic household. How many of those are going to occur? Well, that's going to depend upon the measure of foreign agents coming from economy J to source varieties from economy I. And the measure of those infections will depend upon, again, the share of domestic households that are susceptible and not infected yet, times the fraction of foreign households that are infected. Okay, and so those are going to be the 3 sources of inflows into domestic infections. And then, of course, there's going to be an outflow from infections. A fraction of agents who are infected, gamma, are going to recover each period. And we're going to think in this setting here that once you're recovered, you're immune to the disease, so you can't get infected again. And then for simplicity, we're going to consider the case where there are no vaccines at the moment. Although if I have time, I'll kind of flag later, we actually think that our model has some kind of super interesting predictions for this debate about vaccination and for our optimal policy. And I can say more about that later, depending on how the time goes. Okay, so that's the equation for the flow of infections. Once we've got that, the other equations are straightforward. Obviously, the change in the measure of people who recovered, that's just going to be inflows from the infected state at a constant rate gamma. And then susceptibles are going to decline at a constant rate equal to the flow of agents into the infected status. Okay, so very kind of straightforward mapping from our trade model into disease dynamics. So when we consider the closed economy special case, so a case where trade costs are infinite and there's no trade, nice feature of the model, it's going to collapse exactly to the standard closed economy SIR model. In that case, we can write our three equations for the change in susceptible, infected, and recovered in exactly the way of the standard SIR model. Beta is the contact rate in the standard model, gamma is the recovery rate, and here that contact rate is micro-founded as a function of the primitive parameter alpha and the endogenous choice of how many domestic interactions you choose in the closed economy. And so we have all the standard closed economy SIR results. If the contact rate beta divided by the recovery rate gamma is less than 1, then the pandemic-free equilibrium is stable. So if you start from that equilibrium and have a small measure of infections, the rate of new infections will decline and you'll go back to that pandemic-free equilibrium and the pandemic will never take off. In contrast, if beta over gamma is bigger than 1, then a tiny small measure of initial infections will lead to a pandemic and you'll go through this wave of that disease dynamic. And so the system will experience a period of rising infections until you reach a peak, at which point infections will gradually decline and eventually go down to 0. And we can get this closed form expression here for the share of steady state susceptibles at the end of the pandemic, the fraction of people who don't get infected during the pandemic, and it depends on the contact rate in the standard way. More interestingly, what happens when we go to the open economy? Well, when we go to the open economy, we're going to have a number of kind of more subtle results now about how trade frictions are going to influence the occurrence of the pandemic. So what's the analog of that closed economy R0, beta over gamma? Well, the analog in the closed economy, we're actually going to have a system of dynamical equations. So these are the system of the equations for the change in infections in the home country and the foreign country. And I just represented them in matrix form here. We've got the domestic infections in each country on the diagonal, and then the foreign infections for each country on the off diagonal. And those foreign infections come from buyers going abroad or sellers from abroad coming to the domestic economy. And then we've got the outflows from infection over here. So what's the analog of R0? Well, we're going to think about starting from a no pandemic equilibrium where the share of susceptibles is 1. And we're going to ask the question, when is that equilibrium with susceptibles equal to 1? When is it stable to a small perturbation by a small initial measure of infections in either country? Okay, well, what is that going to depend on? Well, it's going to depend on the stability of this system, which is going to depend upon its largest eigenvalue. And so we can answer that question by computing the largest eigenvalue of what's called the next generation matrix. So that's just multiplying this matrix F for the flows into infections by the inverse of this matrix V for the flows out of infections. That's the analog here to beta divided by gamma. And so the system will be stable when that largest eigenvalue, the spectral radius, is less than 1. Well, given the simple structure here, we can actually solve in closed form for the spectral radius. And it takes this expression down here. And so the no pandemic equilibrium will be unstable whenever this global R0 here, this largest eigenvalue, is strictly greater than 1. In that case, we'll have a pandemic. In contrast, when R0 is less than 1, we won't have a pandemic and the no pandemic equilibrium will be stable. Now, immediately, we're going to get one of our kind of first key results for how globalization affects the pandemic. Look at this expression here for global R0. You'll see that it's monotonically increasing in foreign infections. The more foreign infections there are, The larger Nij or the larger Nji, the larger the value of this global R0. So I can get a lower bound to global R0 just by setting that term equal to 0 and forgetting about it. When I look at that lower bound, well, I can actually just solve this quadratic equation and get the two roots for global R0. And I get this expression down here. And so what do we see about this lower bound for global R0? It depends upon the maximum of the domestic rates of infection in the open economy. And the true global R0 is greater than or equal to that lower bound because of the foreign infections. And that immediately gives us our first result, the really strong cross-country externalities to disease. Whether a global pandemic occurs depends upon the max here, the disease environment in the country with the highest rates of domestic infections. So it doesn't matter if my domestic infections are really low, and in the closed economy, I would not experience a pandemic. If I have even a tiny amount of trade with a country that has a very bad domestic disease environment, that's enough for there to be a global pandemic and for me to experience a wave of infections. Okay, so really powerful epidemiological externalities, and those are very important for thinking about optimal policy and policies towards vaccines, and I'll talk more about that later if I get enough time. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. As we've just said, we're going to get a pandemic whenever that global R0 is strictly greater than 1. There's no pandemic equilibrium is unstable, and we have a unique, stable endemic equilibrium. Again, we can express that endemic equilibrium. We can write in closed form the value of steady state susceptibles in the two countries in that endemic equilibrium, and it takes this expression down here, depending upon the endogenous choices of domestic and foreign interactions. And what I want to do now is just kind of illustrate that solution and illustrate this condition for global R0 to be bigger than 1 by just kind of showing you some numerical solutions of the model. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this two-country case. We're going to calibrate the parameters to the standard values that people have been using in the COVID-19 literature. So we base our parameters on the Chad Jones and Jesus Villaverde paper. And then we're going to show you some comparative statics as to how we change parameters of the model. We affect the likelihood with which a pandemic occurs, R0 is bigger than 1, and the severity of that pandemic when it does occur. And so what have we done down here? Well, we're going to start from the baseline parameters, and then we're going to hold the exogenous disease environment in country 1 constant, and we're going to make the exogenous component of the disease environment in country 2 worse. We're going to increase alpha 2. And in these two diagrams down here, we've illustrated what that does for the likelihood of a pandemic and the severity of the pandemic when it occurs. So in the left panel, we've got the fraction of agents who are recovered at the end of the pandemic. So that's the share of people, the percentage share of people who get infected at some point during the pandemic. And then in the right panel down here, for each parameter value, we've shown you the wave of infections, this is the wave of infections for different numbers of days throughout the course of the pandemic. We're going to start over here with a low value of alpha 1 and alpha 2. So global R0 is less than 1 and there is no pandemic. We're all the way over here where the initial infections die out. Then I'm going to hold alpha 1 constant, worsen the disease environment in country 2. What happens? Well, as we worsen that disease environment, eventually we get to a point where global R0 is bigger than 1. And you can see there's a very nonlinear response to the share of agents who get infected and who are recovered at the end of the pandemic. And notably, even though nothing is changing in country 1, it's experiencing more of a pandemic from the worsened environment in country 2, illustrating those externalities. And the colors of these waves correspond to the colors of the points over here. And you can see as we worsen the disease environment, country 1, where nothing is changing, is experiencing worse and worse pandemics. Okay, so that's the first illustration of the strength of those externalities between the countries in the open economy environment. What does globalization do to pandemics? Does it make pandemics more or less likely? Well, first sharp result, if we consider the case when the countries are symmetric, we're going to get an unambiguous result that more globalization creates more pandemics and makes those pandemics worse whenever they occur. And we've already anticipated that result because we showed when countries are symmetric, lower international frictions increase the overall number of interactions, domestic plus foreign, in all countries around the world. Okay, and this proposition just shows you that once you combine that with the disease dynamics, you immediately get the unambiguous result. The more globalization, raises global R0 and makes the pandemic worse when it does occur. And we've just illustrated this down here in these two figures. The left panel shows the effect of reductions in trade costs, variable trade costs on the intensive margin. The right panel shows the effect of reducing mobility barriers to the extensive margin on the number of interactions. The colored dots show the two countries again, and then the vertical line here is when the global R0 passes the threshold of 1, and then the other curve here shows you how global R0 changes as you reduce frictions. Okay, and so as soon as global R0 falls below 1, you see very quickly again, we get a pandemic in both countries, and it's very sharp and nonlinear. And so that nonlinearity, potentially thinking about the welfare gains from trade, means that it could be important, right? You have a small reduction in trade frictions, that may be enough to cause a global pandemic and create a very nonlinear effect on welfare through deaths. Okay, and so that's one possibility, and that's the kind of intuitive case that most people think, lower trade barriers, more interactions, pandemics are more likely. However, it's not that simple. There's actually very, very rich interactions in the model. It's also possible that more globalization, lower trade barriers can prevent pandemics. When does that occur? Well, that occurs in the case when the countries are asymmetric. Again, it's very intuitive. So what's the intuition for this result? Well, think about the case when the two countries have very, very different disease environments. One of the two countries has a very healthy domestic disease environment. The other country has a very bad domestic disease environment. And we initially start from an equilibrium where there are trade costs. Now, as I reduce trade costs, I take some of the agents in the foreign country with the bad disease environment, I reduce their interactions domestically, and I increase their interactions with my country where the disease environment is very good. Potentially, when the countries are very asymmetric, that redirection of interactions from the bad disease environment to the home country where the disease environment is good can actually take the global economy below the threshold for R0 to be 1, to be above 1. And so when the countries have these very uneven disease environments, by changing the fraction of interactions that occur in bad environments versus good environments, you can take the world below the threshold for a pandemic, R0 bigger than 1, and you can make that pandemic less bad when it does occur. So really kind of interesting sort of result of how globalization affects the likelihood and severity of pandemics. And we show that case here again. In the left panel, we've got reductions in barriers to trade flows. And in the right panel, we've got reductions in the extensive margin of barriers to mobility frictions. Now, so country 1 is the country with the good disease environment. Country 2 is the country with the bad disease environment. When we reduce trade barriers or mobility frictions, we move interactions out of the bad environment in foreign into the good environment at home. Unsurprisingly, that reduces the share of agents who get infected and are recovered at the end of the pandemic for country 2 with the bad disease environment. That's not surprising. More surprising, it's possible that a reduction in trade friction, so say down here from 1.05 to 1 here, can actually reduce the share of agents that get infected and are recovered in the country with the good disease environment. And that's because of this redirection of interactions. I'm taking, over the course of the pandemic, I'm taking more interactions out of the bad environment, putting them into the good environment, and that can reduce the severity of the pandemic when it occurs.
So Stephen, you might emphasize, and I think this is correct, that this is where goods are playing a substitute for the migration of people, because if people were moving across high and low infection rates, you get a mixing result where you revert to the mean. But here I think the diversion of trade is serving that role. So it's kind of a nice, trade substituting for factor mobility result in SIR context. Does that make sense?
Great question. So great question. So the way we've modeled things, trading goods and movements of people go very closely together, because when you trade goods, people move between borders and the buyer has to go abroad to source the goods. So you're right, we're tying movements of goods and people together. And we think there's a lot of evidence for that trade involves people moving and is involved in the spread of pandemics. But your question is great, because you're asking a question, well, more generally, we could think about the idea, when are flows of goods and movements of people complements or substitutes? And obviously, in general, in principle, goods flows and people flows can either substitute or complement for one another, which relates, of course, to Ron's work as you're flagging. And so I think that's a great question. In our model, trade involves these human interactions. You could make that more complicated by allowing degrees of complementarity and substitutability between trading goods and flows of people. And I think that would be a kind of a super interesting thing to do, and also to bring in multiple sectors where, you know, the ratio of trading goods to human interactions varies across sectors. I think there are kind of lots of interesting extensions like that. But I think that this result here is always going to be present, you know, even in those kind of wider models, because it really just hinges on this kind of very basic idea that the two countries have very different disease environments. And when you play with trade costs, you affect the share of interactions that occur in those two different environments. And I think that's kind of a very general result in any model where trade involves some degree of interaction. So yeah, but great question. And then just very briefly, and this perhaps also very intuitive, another result you can get in the open economy, you get much more subtle disease dynamics. Even if a country would have a single wave in the closed economy, it can have multiple waves in the open economy. When does that occur? Well, very intuitively, imagine the two countries have very different timings of their epidemics. So one country has a kind of very fast epidemic that's over very quickly. The other country has a very slowly building epidemic. Then it's sort of very intuitive that in the open economy, the country with a fast initial epidemic might actually get a second wave because it's trading with the other country whose epidemic is building very slowly. And that's exactly what you see illustrated in the simulation down here. To get this result, you need the two countries both to have very different timings of the epidemic, but you also need them to be very different sizes, because otherwise, if they're too similar in size, the two countries coordinate on a single pandemic in the open economy. But again, much richer disease dynamics in the open economy. Okay, so we already see there are very subtle interactions, even when, you know, globalization affects pandemics, but there are no feedbacks from pandemics to globalization. What we want to try to study now is what happens when we introduce those feedbacks. And we're first going to introduce GE effects, and then later we're going to introduce behavioral responses. So to introduce those GE effects, we're going to assume agents are unaware of the threat of infection still, but the infection causes deaths, and that's going to affect labor supplies. And, you know, it would be very similar if we allowed the infection to affect productivity. And so for the moment, we're just going to focus on the infection affecting deaths. So how is that going to change things? Well, we've built up the model, and it's actually going to be very easy to see now how that affects things. There are going to be two main changes for allowing for deaths. So what are those changes? Well, when agents get infected, they can now flow into two different states. A fraction of them are going to die with probability eta, and a fraction gamma are going to recover with probability gamma. And so gamma over eta is going to control the fraction of infected agents that either die or get recovered. Okay, so in particular, eta over gamma plus eta are going to be the fraction who die, and the remainder will recover. And so that's the first change to the dynamical system. Some agents die, and that'll affect labor supplies and have GE effects that I'll show in a second. The second change, which is going to complicate the dynamical system, when deaths occur and they change labor supply, that's going to change the wage rate, the relative wages in the two countries. And so wages are going to evolve over the course of the pandemic. But of course, we showed earlier that the intensity with which the two countries interact, the number of varieties they source from one another, will also depend upon relative wages. And so the number of interactions is going to change endogenously over the course of the pandemic. And that's going to affect the dynamics of the SAR model because there are no longer constant contact rates. The contact rates evolve endogenously with changes in relative wages. To see the impact of deaths on relative wages, we just adjust our goods market clearing condition. Income in each country equals expenditure on the goods produced from that country, take into account that a fraction of agents, capital D, die as a result of the pandemic. And then it's perhaps, you know, very intuitive from general equilibrium trade models. If a country experiences more deaths than another country, that's going to reduce its relative labor supply and increase its relative wage. And in our model, that's going to provide a general equilibrium social distancing force. Because the relative wage goes up in the country that has more deaths, you're going to trade less with it. That's going to reduce interactions, and that's going to reduce the spread of disease, even though no one's aware of the threat of infection. It's a purely GE force. And interestingly, which country has more infections than the other can change over the course of the pandemic. As in the case we were discussing earlier, when one country has a quick wave of infections, the other has a slow wave of infections. So you can get really quite subtle predictions for relative wage effects and general equilibrium social distancing. And this figure here just illustrates that general equilibrium social distancing. So we've got the case where country 2 has a higher death rate than country 1, and so it experiences more deaths and an increase in its relative wage. And so in blue here, we've got the relative wage of country 2, We've normalized the wage rate for country 1 to equal 1. It's our choice of numeraire. And over here, we see general equilibrium of social distancing. So as country 2 experiences more deaths and its relative wage goes up, country 1 trades less with it. And foreign interactions decline here in country 1. And that gets manifested in the price index. As you source less from a foreign country because its relative wage has gone up, that raises the price index. And then finally, it's also obviously going to affect welfare. Welfare is going to change both because of deaths and because of these GE effects on the number of varieties that you source over the course of the pandemic. So already a kind of really interesting set of feedbacks from the general equilibrium component of the model.
Steve, can I ask a question?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So, so here there's no hospital capacity issues. The death's just a fraction of the infected. If you include that, I'm not sure in general, because it feels like the death rate, I mean, death is very important because of life values, but in general, the rate is very small as a total population. And how important is that to affect the wage?
Yeah, great question.
I think it's an interesting part to analyze. I just don't know quantitatively how important is that.
Well, great question. You can actually think about kind of two further modifications of this. So one is exactly the hospital capacity effect you suggested. And so deaths might become more likely if you hit up against a capacity constraint. And over the course of the pandemic, you might come close to hitting that capacity constraint, and that would increase deaths. It's a great point. The other complication you could think of here is you could think about, and this is going to become more relevant when we get onto the behavioral effects, you could think about individuals being able to adopt different technologies that make them more likely or less likely to get infected. So for example, face masks. And in this kind of very simple GE effects, we don't have any hospital capacity, we don't have any face masks. And I think both of those would be kind of pretty interesting extensions. In these kind of GE simulations that we study here, we've got a pretty low death rate. It's kind of pretty close to the standard values people are assuming. And we find that these general equilibrium effects are very small. Even when we crank up that death rate to really high levels, we find that these kind of GE effects are still pretty small. And so I think one of the things that's going to come out of this sort of GE analysis is to really worry about those hospital capacity issues and deaths more generally. You need to build in behavioral responses. And I'll say more about that in a second. But yeah, it's a great question. We don't have hospital capacity. It'd be a super interesting extension, as would sort of allowing people to use a better technology when they trade, such as face masks. That's also another really interesting point.
Sorry, I have another clarifying question. Very, very interesting, Steve. I guess another thing you could have also considered was that to think about general effects on the labor market effects. Like while you're infected, you could also think about not interacting as much. I mean, you're doing here the case, if I'm dead, of course, I'm out.
Yep.
There's a sense in which while you're infected, you might actually not go to work, you might not, so that's another GE effect that you actually might get. So if you haven't considered that, I'm wondering why, because it looks like it would be easy to add.
Absolutely, yeah, it's also a great question. Yeah, we did actually discuss that case in the paper. You're absolutely right. It would be, relatively straightforward to allow, instead of deaths, that once you're infected, that reduces your productivity, either in production or in trade, or potentially both production and trade. And so if you think about it as just your overall effective units of labor are reduced while you're infected, that would operate a lot like deaths. So it would just proportionally reduce the labor supply you have, and it would operate very similar to deaths, as you just pointed out. The particular dynamics over the course of the pandemic would obviously be slightly different, because the deaths occur here only as you transition out of being infected, whereas in the kind of labor supply case, your labor supply would be reduced the entire time you're infected. And so quantitatively, it would be slightly different, but you're absolutely right. You could model it symmetrically in a very, very similar way. So it's a great point.
Because it would affect two things, right? It also would affect interaction between susceptible and infected. So you're allowing infected to still interact with the susceptible and to still interact with others in the rest of the world via trade. So there's two roles that the infected are doing, and you could actually play around on. They might still be interacting with susceptibles, but not in trade, or vice versa.
Yep, absolutely. So the simplest case would be it affects proportionately the ability to produce and trade. And then, as you just pointed out, in principle, you could allow it to differ between those two and be different for production and trade. Again, that would be another super interesting extension. And again, there'd be G effects. And yep, it's a great point. But let me make sure I have enough time just to show you the behavioral effects, because I think they're kind of also super interesting. And so in the very final stage of the paper, we're also now going to allow agents to explicitly internalize the threat of infection when they choose how much to interact with other households. Okay, so agents now realize that deaths are related to the pandemic. And following Farbudi et al., we're going to model that in the following way to keep that problem tractable. We're going to suppose that all agents are asymptomatic. And so you don't know your current state except at the point you die. And so what households are going to do is they're going to use the structure of the model and rational expectations to work out the probability they're susceptible, infected, or recovered using the structure of the model. Okay. So household behavior is independent of their specific health status, but their actual behavior is shaped by their expectation of the probability of being susceptible, infected, and recovered. And they're just going to compute those probabilities using the observed deaths that they see in the data, the structure of the model, and rational expectations. So what's going to happen now? So now this is a super complicated problem, right? Because households are solving this dynamic, forward-looking rational expectations problem. They're choosing the intensity with which to interact with agents in each country around the world at each point in time over the course of the pandemic. And so to kind of keep that problem tractable, we're going to make the assumption that at the beginning of the pandemic, agents are going to commit to an optimal strategy to follow over the course of the pandemic. And that optimal strategy is going to specify the intensity with which they interact with agents in each country around the world at each point in time over the course of the pandemic. So how are we going to solve that problem? Well, we're going to just solve for this forward-looking of maximization of the net present value of welfare at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm choosing these functions, the intensity with which I interact with agents in the two countries at each point in time, so they're functions of time. And I'm choosing those functions to maximize the net present value of welfare, discounted. What's the flow utility? Well, that's the instantaneous utility I get from consuming varieties generated by interactions, minus the instantaneous costs of obtaining those interactions. And then I'm only going to get utility while I'm alive. And so I'm going to have to discount those instantaneous flows by the probability that I'm still alive at a point in time. So 1 minus little k at time t is the probability that I'm alive at some future point in time t. How do I compute those probabilities of being alive? Well, I work them out using the observed deaths and the structure of the model. In particular, I can just use the SIR equations for the measure of agents that are susceptible, infected, and recovered and dead. I can use those equations to work out probabilistically what is the probability that I am infected or susceptible or recovered. And so I'm just going to use those SIR equations. Slight wrinkle relative to the previous versions of the model. Obviously, I only control the interactions by my own buyer when I go to meet other households. I don't control the decisions made by other domestic households and other foreign interactions of coming to meet me. And so that's why they're indicated by a star here, because I can only control my choices of how many varieties to consume. And the instantaneous flow and cost are the same as before. So what's the solution to that problem? Well, we're going to have the standard optimality conditions for the choice of the control variable, which are here the intensity of interactions at each point in time. And then we've got the optimality conditions for the evolution of the co-state variables and the usual transversality conditions. Okay, and so what's the main result in this forward-looking behavioral model? Well, the main result is we get this sort of analytical characterization of social distancing. So what's going to happen in the model when agents internalize the threat of infection? Well, when they don't internalize the threat of infection, each period agents equate the marginal benefit of interactions, the marginal utility from current interactions, to the marginal cost. So the derivative of the consumption index with respect to interactions equals the derivative of the cost function with respect to interactions. When I internalize the threat of infection, I take account that today, when I interact with agents, that raises my probability of being infected, which affects my future utility because it affects the probability I'm going to die. And so what do I do in this forward-looking rational expectations equilibrium? Well, I reduce my current interactions. I reduce my current interactions, so I raise the marginal benefit of flow in that interactions in terms of the consumption index above the marginal cost of those flow interactions. And that's just saying social distancing. I cut down my current interactions by social distancing to try to reduce the probability I die and I get future utility in the future. And so that now generates some pretty rich interactions, and I'll try and give you a quick flavor of those. So first, illustrate them with country symmetry. We've got the model with no behavioral responses in the black dots. And then we've got two versions of the model with behavioral responses with a high death rate in dark blue and a low death rate in light blue. And you can see when the death rates, the first thing you can see here is that behavioral responses flatten the curve. So in both cases, the blue curves are flatter than the model without behavioral responses. Second thing you can see is that when the death rate is higher, you're more aggressive at cutting back on interactions, obviously because there's a greater risk of death. And so that flattening of the curve is more aggressive when there's a higher death rate. You see over here that behavioral responses lower deaths in both the cases of a high and low death rate. But what is the cost of reducing deaths? The cost of reducing deaths is you have less interactions. And so you get a rise in the price index, and that rise in the price index is greater in the high death rate case when there is a more aggressive behavioral response. And then interestingly, another prediction of the model, trade to GDP falls. Why does trade to GDP fall? Because foreign interactions are relatively high cost interactions. Okay? The given standard trade shares are relatively low. That means that the trade costs abroad reduce foreign sales relative to domestic sales, exactly as George was asking earlier. So because trade shares tend to be relatively low, when you cut back your interactions, you're more aggressive in reducing your foreign interactions because they're relatively high cost interactions. And that's why the ratio of trade to GDP falls. Okay, so very interesting kind of implication of the model that foreign interactions are disproportionately affected relative to domestic interactions. That just shows you that that's stronger when there is a lot of international trade, when there are a lot of interactions to cut back on. Finally, just to really illustrate the real richness of this framework, I'll show you what happens when you have asymmetric countries with this behavioral responses. So now one of the countries, country 1, has low mortality, country 2 has high mortality. So what does that mean? It means because country 1 is a low risk of death, you're going to be less aggressive on your behavioral responses. And so country 1 is going to have a much quicker and higher peaked initial wave of the pandemic. And that's what you see over here. Country 1 initially has more infections because there's less behavioral response, because there's less risk of death. And so a lot of people get infected. What does that do now? Well, now agents internalize there's a high risk of getting infected if you go to country 1. And that's actually going to reduce demand for country 1's varieties. And so we see a reduction in its relative wage in the initial stages of the pandemic when it is the more infected country. However, because country 1's wave of infections is over very quickly because there's very little behavioral response, later in the pandemic that switches. And country 2 actually becomes the country where there are more infections because it's had the more aggressive behavioral response and it's flattened the curve a lot more. And so you see these relative wage effects flip towards the end of the pandemic. Finally, over here, we also have price index effects as a result of cutting back on interactions that they're moderated in the country that experiences a fall in its relative wage. And again, we have a fall in ratio of trade to GDP. That's particularly dramatic for country 2 in the early stages of the pandemic because it's now engaging in individual level social distancing from country 1, which has this rapid initial wave of infections. Country 2 cuts back a lot on its interactions with country 1, and that reduces a lot country 2's ratio of trade to GDP. Sorry, I've just run over by a couple of minutes. I should just try to wrap up. We also have a little section on adjustment costs related to one of George's earlier comments. What do we try to do? We tried to develop a model of human interaction where we can jointly analyze the interaction between globalization and pandemics. We write the model to rationalize the standard gravity equation in trade flows and to also match the standard SIR model of disease dynamics. In the open economy, there are very powerful epidemiological externalities. Whether a pandemic occurs depends upon the domestic disease environment in the country with the highest rates of domestic disease infections. We think that has super interesting implications for policy, which we're super happy to talk about later. And then we find, interestingly, globalization can either raise or reduce the likelihood of pandemics or their severity. Symmetric countries, it raises the likelihood of pandemics. But when countries are different, it's possible that globalization can reduce the likelihood of the pandemic. Disease dynamics in general, much richer in the open economy. We can get general equilibrium social distancing when we have deaths. So the country which has more infections experiences more deaths, a rise in its relative wage, and hence there's less trade with that country. And then very finally, when we introduce behavioral level responses, individuals internalize the threat of infection. We find they're much more powerful than the GE effects. And in fact, in that case, the country which has more infections experiences a fall in its relative wage as agents source less varieties from that country. We find that building in these behavioral responses is central to generating large reductions in trade as a ratio of output. And it's also introducing deaths and behavioral responses is important for aggregate welfare. We find substantial effects on aggregate welfare both through deaths and then also through reduction in gains from trade as agents flatten the curve during the course of the pandemic. But I should stop there to stay on time. Sorry, I ran over by a few minutes, George.
No, this is perfect, and it leads in really well to our policy panel later on at starting at noon. So this is great. Do we have some more open questions? I've always got open questions, so I guess the first question I would just ask is, how well does the model sort of match up with the data in terms of what we've seen on trade flows and industrial activity? My sense is actually trade has had, given how big the economic downturn is, trade has actually held up really, really well. So even if it's kind of plunged at record levels.
Great question. So actually, Paul just wrote a paper for the ECB where he was exactly looking at the recent data on trade during the pandemic. It's interesting. In the early stages of the pandemic, you actually find quite a big fall in trade as a ratio of output. And people tracked that initially with sort of GPS coordinates of ships moving around the world. And you also start to see a little bit of it in the trade data as well. It does look though that trade has been recovering quite rapidly from that initial large drop. So that sort of initial drop is very sort of consistent with the model we've written down. That recovery could in part be related to sort of improved, related to one of Jan's questions. It could be related to improved technologies for engaging in interactions. So for example, as we've got better about wearing masks, structuring our interactions in a way that reduces the probability of infection, that could partly be one of the reasons for that relatively rapid recovery in trade from the initial effects of the pandemic. I think if you were to take the model to the data, you'd probably want to use variation across sectors. You'd have a kind of multi-sector model, because in some sectors, sort of goods are very differentiated. It's really important to have interactions between people, and in those, when you trade your goods, to find out about the characteristics of the good, to be sure the person's going to deliver on the contract. And so in those type of sectors, we'd expect the forces in our model to be more important. In other sectors where there's like a standard market price for the good, like for example, wheat or coal or something, you might think that the interactions are less important in trade, and you'd expect to see less effects of the kind that we're studying in this paper. And so, I think it would be really interesting to kind of dig in more detail to the data, and we really kind of hope that our analysis encourages people to do that. As I was saying earlier, there's actually quite a lot of evidence there's some really cool papers on the Black Death, which I got really excited about. It was like, I do some historical stuff where you actually really see that the Black Death follows trade routes very closely, and gravity provides quite a good approximation to the evolution of the disease. We even found some stuff by epidemiologicalists, sorry, I said that wrong, showing the role that globalization plays in the spread of disease in general. So I think it would be super interesting to look at this more empirically. I think you'd want to use great variation across sectors. There's definitely early evidence that trade has fallen as a share of GDP. I haven't yet seen evidence looking at that by sector and so on, and that would be super interesting to look at. So it's a great point.
Right. And I think it would be fascinating to also think, and maybe the older data is going to be helpful for this, to think what the long-term implications will be for trade, right? To the extent that, we're not investing in some of those linkages. I'm not sure if your adjustment cost view looked at that, but maybe historically, when you can kind of trace the disease to a particular trading partner, that has really sustained impacts on how you interact with them. And I think that's something that we're going to be, dealing with in the future.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I was just short on time. I didn't get to say as much there as I wanted to. You're absolutely right. It's actually really interesting. So we have a section in the paper on adjustment costs. And adjustment costs are interesting for a couple of reasons. So one reason is they obviously kind of mute the behavioral response precisely because it's costly to adjust. That's the sort of first effect. And then the second effect, which relates very strongly to the question you're asking, is we were expecting to see very kind of strong anticipatory effects in the model. So, once you have adjustment costs, if I know the pandemic's coming, you'd expect that to influence my current stock of interactions, right? Because when I choose my interactions today, there are going to be costs of adjusting them, and I'm going to take into account that in the future I want to adjust them. I'd expect to see some anticipation of that today. At least for symmetric adjustment costs, which is the version of the model we wrote down and studied in the paper, we find that an anticipatory effect is very, very small. And so that kind of militates towards the idea that once this pandemic is over, we're going to kind of go back pretty quickly to our business as usual state of the affairs. So one way to change that obviously would be, maybe now we've had this pandemic, that affects our expectation of the future probability that a pandemic occurs, or there's some kind of change in the way people perceive things, even through kind of behavioral effects. Or you'd have to depart from symmetric adjustment costs to build in asymmetric costs, a more kind of dynamic stock flow formulation of contacts and so on. I think all of those would be kind of super interesting to study, but at least for the kind of very simple way we initially specified adjustment costs, we found that the anticipatory effects were much smaller than we were expecting, which we thought was very, very interesting.
Great. Well, I don't want to take up all the time. This was great, Steve. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add. Nope. Okay. So